Hey everybody, I'm Sean Robinson.
And Brittany Graham.
Welcome to Living the Line, and today we're going to have another installment of what are we calling this thing again?
Is it
Uh,
show and tell?
Show and Tell, comic show and tell, yeah. And I had to say, Brandon, I normally don't listen back at all to anything we've done. Some, critics might critics might be aware of that. Uh, uh, and I listened to our comic show and tell about Norikazu Kawashima and her Frankenstein, and it was really enjoyable. And it was not as leisurely as I had anticipated. I felt like we covered a lot of ground, and it was fairly interesting.
Oh,
So hopefully we're going to be in a similar situation today.
yes. Yeah. We'll be very entertained. But so are you announcing what we're talking about today, or are we just jumping into it?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. So yeah, speaking of horror manga, we're going to be talking about one of the greats of the horror genre today.
The Smurfs and the Magic Flute. Yes. That's
Yeah,
that's the first Smurfs volume ever as well.
right, exactly. So Peo, is that how you say his name?
I believe so.
So where did you first hear about? I mean, okay, I'm going to make some assumptions, Brandon. Did you watch Smurfs cartoons when you were a kid?
Oh yeah, guilty as charged.
Yeah, me too, man. Which what do you remember from the early experience?
Well, I think I saw the Magic Flute early on because I was really, or maybe that was like my secondary my second Smurfs experience because I mean I remember seeing the toys before anything, and then I remember knowing the Smurfs and then being very confused when I saw the Magic Flute because we should talk about how the Smurfs originated in another comic. Um,
Right. Yeah, think in English they're calling it, what is the name that they have like slightly anglicized names. We're going to be talking about English editions today when we're talking about this, but
right, it was called yeah, it's like something in Pee Wee, if I'm remembering right.
oh yeah, pay
Johann and Pee Wit is
Johann and Peewit. There we go.
that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, but there was this Hanna-Barbera cartoon that started out as an adaptation of the original Smurfs comic, and that's what we're talking about right at this moment. And they would adapt different graphic novels, and this is one of them is straight from the original first appearance of the Smurfs in Johann and Peewit.
Yeah.
And so you saw that as a kid, you saw that Hanna-Barbera cartoon.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And yeah, and I remember being really enamored with it at first. Like I really liked the mushroom houses. And I think a lot of that might have been connected to the appeal of when I saw Kira Toriyama stuff and he was doing in Dr. Slump he was doing like there'd be a cafe they'd go to that was like a shape of a giant tea kettle.
Yeah. And there's something about scale stuff with kids. Maybe it's because as a kid you're built at a different scale than all the adults around you.
Hmm.
But I know my kids were really fascinated by Elsa. I'm gonna I'm gonna see how many names I can forget today in our conversation. There's
Sure.
a Swedish illustrator who made children's books and books for adults in the 1800s. Elsa Besko or something like that. And she would draw little gnome children who, wore like acorn caps for hats
Nice.
and things like that. And they loved that, like, I mean, I love it too, but they like seemed like they were inhabiting it and connecting it.
That makes sense. I mean, you're given toys and your whole world is kind of a lot of it can be imagination. I remember playing with action figures and seeing like the ground level of like my backyard and just like imagining trees as like these giant castles and things like that. So imagine if you're a kid and someone shows that to you as a fiction, it's like that's where I'm at right now. You get me, bro.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it was weird. I watched this one of the few. I was only allowed to watch television on weekends because my parents were tired as hell, and presumably this was a way for them to get me out of their hair for a little bit. And so they had some type of power block of cartoons on Saturday mornings, and they had the Smurfs, And whatever season it was at right then, I was watching like sixth one or something like that. And I remember thinking like, oh, this is pretty cool, but there's this little kid vibe to it. And then after a season would run, they would do earlier episodes, right? So whether it appeared in syndication or they just reran them, I'm not sure. But I remember the first time that I saw the one, the Smurfette, and I was just absolutely like transfixed. Like here was this thing that I was already thinking of as a little kids comic, but all of a sudden, this evil wizard dude who wants to eat them clearly makes a female out of clay as a temptation for them. And she's like this imperfect being with, she's not quite appealing enough to them to be a temptress. And then they remake her and welcome her into the community. And she becomes the temptress that he wanted to in the first place. But
Good look, isn't it?
yeah, but simultaneously, like pushes out the, her desire to like please Gargamel. And she's all about hanging out with the Smurfs now. And it was such a like potent thing. And then, I didn't have access to any of these comics or anything because they weren't in English, right? All of a sudden, the next thing you grow up to be an adult, you've got your own kids, and you're like, holy moly, these actually not only were this amazing comic in another language, they've actually come out in English, apparently 10 years ago.
Sure.
And you can get them for your kids. And apparently, if you do that, your kids will be obsessed with them. So here's the Paper Cuts edition.
Yeah, and we should mention Paper Cuts is actually a division of NBM that published a lot of other European work. Actually, I worked for NBM in the early 2000s.
Right, and I believe they were bought out by Mad Cave Studios at this point.
Oh, fascinating.
I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that they've switched.
So I was hoping, my old editor is a guy named Terry Nattier, the N in NBM. And
right.
My hope is that he was there still toiling away, putting out Smurfs comics.
Right. Well, I think he was, if I'm not mistaken. But I actually saw Terry at Mocha Fest.
Okay.
This year. But yeah, so they did two of these simultaneously. So this is the first one that I bought for my suddenly Smurf interested kids.
Nice.
And like you were saying, this is the first story. It's actually a Johann and Peewit graphic novel that has Papa Smurf in it. And I was kind of disappointed by the format. This is a much smaller size. With my old eyes, this is almost unreadable with the font. Exactly right. Yeah, this is just totally shrunken down and everything. And then I find out that they actually did five editions of this Treasury series here. And my almost 9-year-old especially gets obsessed with this kind of things. And when he really gets obsessed, he wants every single one. So of course we went through and found all of them that they printed. And it's really it's quite the thing to read because you and I were talking about this earlier in the week. Was a phenomenal cartoonist.
Yeah, no, the actual drawing in it is fantastic. A slight aside, what are your thoughts as a book designer on Paper Cut's logo being a Z? It's very confusing to me.
It's a tragedy. These are actually some. Yeah, this is I don't know. I don't want to poo-poo somebody else's design work. There are some really great choices involved in this, and
Sure.
Some of the things are very interesting. This is one of those things that just absolutely just had to grit my teeth. Is when you've designed something as a physical element, and then instead of making it a physical element, you just put a little drop shadow. Like, no, this really is a belly band here.
Oh yeah, it's also surprising to me when any foreign editions of things come over where there's literally like probably near 100 Smurfs covers in production that were made by Peyo or his studio, and it's like, why not use one of those as the cover? You don't have to mash up a new cover like with Americans who've never seen it.
Yeah, and the original covers are fantastic. They're really, really nice. Do you have any editions that were done prior to the sort of digital reworking of the colors and everything?
I don't. Mostly I was looking at it digitally today. I'd looked at them years ago. Yeah, it's interesting because I was trying to parse apart like a lot of the Franco-Belgian stuff. My understanding is it I guess there's some similarities to how manga works in it, where a series will become popular with just a creator toiling on it. And
Right.
once it becomes popular and there's a need for much more output, then a studio gets constructed. And suddenly you have, you know, five other people all helping you draw the comic. And it becomes much harder to tell whose line is whose on it. So
Yeah.
I something that I learned reading up about the Smurfs is that Peyo, the Smurfs creator, was really was close with Franklin, who Andres Franklin, I'm sure I'm
Hmm.
butchering his name, who did a lot of like Spiro comics, and uh,
Right.
and you can see a lot of the similar line, especially in later Smurfs. It looks a lot like Franklin stuff.
Yeah, I was talking to Emil Vendipede about the Franco-Belgian scene, and he was talking about how a lot of these series are continuing today with the name of the dead author still attached uh,
Oh
to
yeah, I
them.
was equating it to how in I knew some friends that drew Simpsons or Futurama comics, and they would draw a cover and then they'd print it and it would say Matt Groening on it to the signature. And I think that's the deal that the Smurfs and Peyo have now. If you put out a drawing of the Smurfs, it has his signature on it, even though my understanding is I think he died in '92 and his children took over the brand.
Right. Yeah. And his wife was the colorist. I'm pretty sure that the originals were process color, and so they've kind of updated these with, digital flat colors, similar to the other ones, similar to
Yeah, we
like,
should mention his wife's first name was Nine, which I thought was interesting.
yeah. And this is very similar to the Fantagraphics presentation of Carl Barks' library, and that's another example, by the way, of something that I would have killed for as a kid, but was not available to me. Like I had a Carl Barks comic as a kid because I had somebody had given me it was like a small landscape edition of one of his comics had been turned into a book, picture book style. It's the one about the Donald finding a Viking horn that proved that the Vikings had been to North America in a certain time, and the descendants of the Viking were going to claim North America as theirs based on this providence of this horn. And I was just like, holy shit, I've never read a comic that's this good. Where did this come from? And, you're 6 years old. I had already
Right.
read hundreds of comics at that point, but I didn't have the resources to find out who the hell made this. His name wasn't on the book, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, I think there's something. I mean, that's the legend of Karl Barks, right? Is for years people just called him the good duck artist because there are other guys doing ones that weren't hitting as hard with people. I wonder
Right.
how it felt for the other cartoonists when if they caught on being like, "Oh, you work on Donald Duck comics. Do you know who the good duck artist is?" It's like, "Hey, I do that too."
Maybe that's me, huh? There's a certain style. I mean, it's weird. I don't want to like we're not talking about it on camera. We're not showing the images, so I don't want to go out and buy these damn books, right? Find copies of the 2 or 3 volumes that are still around. But there is a certain kind of like I've been calling this sort of an international style. These really are of a piece. You could see Peyo and Floyd Gottfredson and early Tezuka and Charles Schultz all like sitting in the same space, and not be flipped out by it. I think, Tintin probably qualifies as well.
Yeah, I wonder with a lot of those, especially like the more squat characters, I wonder if a lot of that is just how all permeating Disney was at the time.
Right.
Because that's certainly it with like Tezuka is just doing so much. It's fascinating to see like Tezuka famously would like watch Bambi every day for for years of his life or something. He watched it like some amazing amount of times, but and then he has a like there's a manga Tezuka Bambi comic
Right.
where he just was like, I'm gonna do this thing, and then yeah, and then the cartooning in all of them is like it has this this animation weight to it that's so cool.
Yeah, they've got the squash and stretch. You have way more attention to the design of the characters and staying on model all the time. even the clean line style. I mean, you could probably, somebody has already made the argument somewhere, but you could probably attribute that to the like clean studio style of the early animation pieces, which couldn't be until the 60s or something. They never mimeographed the line. The pencil line never survived in animation, you know, in a major production that I'm aware of until you got to the mid 60s or whatever. So, you know, you had all those women, the only women who worked in the animation studio, sitting there inking the final lines, you know, in a sort of like nondescript brush style.
Yeah, it's interesting. It'd be interesting to look at the timelines because I wonder if Hergé doing Tintin was the one kind of coming because he was because I know the Tintin stuff was like in the 30s, kind of I guess working simultaneously to like early Disney stuff. So yeah,
Yeah, but it's also not yeah, it's hard to say. The early Tintin stuff is not as precise, I don't think. Like
no, yeah, it takes a couple books to get there, but yeah, the animation thing does make sense. Something I want to touch on with Smurfs is how different. Like I was always impressed at the kind of flow of the Smurf hat and how hard it is to draw. And when you look at the early Smurf stuff when they first show up, they look like somebody. It looked like you asked your uncle to draw you a Smurf and he's doing it from memory. Like they're atrocious looking as far like their hats are basically just like wizard hats with a little lump on top.
uh-huh.
And it only over the course of several books do they actually um, get that like perfect like Smurf shape for their hats. Oh, also something interesting that I was doing is so the Magic Flute's the first Smurf story where they first show up. After it became really popular, Peyo wrote and directed the Magic Flute animated movie,
Hmm.
and it kind of has a lot of the same story beats as the comic, but he changes a lot of the visuals. Like
Hmm.
for instance, one of the weird things about it is for the main two characters who are in this kind of standard medieval uh, Europe to get to the land of the Smurfs, they go to a wizard who's like, oh, in the comic he talks about how incredibly far it is and how there's like lakes of lava and you can't get there. It sounds like the land of Oz or something. Um, but in the animated version, he just says like no one knows the road to where the Smurfs are, but for some reason he can hypnotize them and that gets them there. And so in so he hypnotizes them and they just wake up in the middle of nowhere and maybe the idea is they were just like wandering blindly or they transported or something. It's like never
Hmm.
made clear and it's kind of dark for that.
Yeah.
But in the comic book, they wake in like kind of a barren landscape. They're just like in the middle of like a dirt field with dead trees around them, and it looks like they woke up in hell. And then the animated version, it's kind of what you think of as like a classic Smurf forest.
Right.
So it's very different, and the Smurfs all know who they are, which is another weird element of it. But they can't communicate with the Smurfs because they're so thick and they're like calling everything a Smurf.
Right. Yeah, the early ones are oftentimes co-written by Yvon Delporte,
Okay.
and apparently he and Peo were friends, social friends, and this is the actual origin of it is the verbal tick that you're talking about, which is that the Smurf language, you know, that each of the Smurfs says the word Smurf and uses it entirely contextually. So like the context is your only ability to tell whether they're using the word Smurf to describe that they're going to punch somebody or whether they're using as a noun for the thing that they're going to eat.
Right. It's like in Chinese, how if you say something with a slightly different accent, it means and context, of course, it means totally different things.
Right. And it's funny, you would think that this is not a joke that could last over hundreds or thousands of pages, but it's actually like surprisingly funny. You know, I had to do some read alouds with this because, of course, my 5-year-old um, does not read perfectly yet and wants it out loud. And you know,
Sure.
it's amazing how funny it is. It's also amazing how funny it is when you have a 5-year-old coming to his brother saying abusively like, "Smurf your Smurf hole."
You're giving them tools for destruction here. Yeah, it is. It is fun. I think that's the nice thing about, because there's an element of like it's funny when I went on my big Tintin kick. Like, there's a lot. I realized quickly though it wasn't universal for everyone that was a fan of comics. I'd be like, some of these are a little dry, but if you enjoy alcoholism and head injuries, it's for you. But Smurfs is very fun and universal.
It is, huh? I mean, it'd be hard to dislike it. From a craft perspective, it's immaculate. You've got these sort of stage-like. That's the other thing that reminds me of Schultz is a lot of this construction. I'm moving from left to right across a platform, and the platform is basically the ground is the panel border,
Right.
and then you'll have an establishing shot that is obviously like rich with detail and everything like that. But like, there's a real pleasure to the craft. They're funny as hell, and they're like just dark enough to have or have dark enough implications to be like rich to a reading adult.
Yeah, there's something interesting about the Smurfs is just this, you think of them like, oh, it's just a fun little village of cartoon characters. But then there's little moments of it, like Papa Smurf being like casually mentioning that he's 500 years old. And yeah, just like things about Smurfs that they were not human, and I was
Yeah.
reading a little bit about on the Wikipedia about the origin of them too, and apparently Peo came up with him when he was out eating with Franklin and uh, couldn't remember the name for the salt when he asked for it.
Right.
So he's like, "Pass me," and the Belgian is something like "Skullstruff."
Strumpf. Right. Yeah. Pass me the strumpf.
Yeah, yeah, and I was reading a little bit about how um, originally I think there was an English or American version where they just called them goblins in the translation,
Ooh.
and that didn't stick very long. But
Yeah.
something interesting is I'm not remember the actual word for it, but in Israel, I believe they gave them like there was a slang name for slippers that was kind of out of use that they were just like, oh, we'll call them like that. Which I think the German for sock sounds a lot like Scoomf.
Interesting.
Uh, but apparently in Israel, nobody they became so synonymous with Smurfs that nobody uses it for slang for slippers anymore.
There's something about that word, that whoever came up with the English adaptation of it, I mean, I think it did an excellent job of anglicizing it. It's not an easy thing, where uh, to find something that evokes a similar enough, uh, effect of the original language while also retaining some of its flavor as well. You can do backflips to try to get the same meaning, but if it doesn't taste the same, it's worthless.
Yeah, yeah, it is impressive. It's yeah, I keep something I keep thinking back to the Smurfs is how well, especially in the later books, how well they draw dirt. Like there's just like very casual, fun way of kind of squiggle out every line. It feels perfect.
Right. There's a there's an interesting effect when you read them all. This is decades. If you bought these 5 editions, you got decades worth of comics condensed into a few volumes, and it is interesting to see like sort of studioisms develop over time in terms of the architecture or the just general line. I'm not recalling any dirt off the top of my head, but like look at these like dry brush explosions
Oh yeah.
here. And this is like late 70s, early 80s Smurfs, so it's already been around for.
And the shadows and the kind of, I don't know what you call them, little scat lines around the little three
Hmm.
dots. I think
Yeah,
those are really appealing.
the Emanata.
Oh yeah, those as well. Yeah, yeah. It's interesting because Smurfs is something you kind of don't like. I don't think about the cartooning in Smurfs. Then you go back and look at it, and you're like, this is beautiful. Like
Yeah, it's
no
it's really
one
something.
drawing X-Men today is as good of a cartoonist as the guys drawing Smurfs in 1972. And that is a weird thing to wrap my brain around.
Well, yeah, no, that is a really, yeah. I mean, I think you could probably say that for several decades.
Yeah,
Somebody who's a stylist who has that kind of consistency that they can apply situationally. I mean, that's like If we're going to limit that to X-Men artists, I mean, you're talking about, you know, I don't even want to say because we're going to get comments. 2 or 3 people over 5 decades, you know.
Yeah, and I'm not even meaning it as an insult to X-Men
No.
artists. It's just that like this cartooning and just technical drawing ability is like blows me away as an adult.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you.
And I
Uh,
think something that's really interesting to me is like I came to Franco-Belgian comics through Heavy Metal and Mobius, and then you're like seeing where all this style and everything came from was not just, you know, Mobius emerging whole cloth. He had this whole culture of incredibly beautiful, brilliant cartoonists doing things that we think of as like that I think of as Mobius lines.
yeah, that's a very interesting. That's a very interesting observation.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big interesting thing of that Mobius was doing, it was a big part of it, which is interesting for me to kind of peel up because obviously there's a lot of things that are very Mobius, but I think a lot of it was him taking classic uh, French and Belgian comics and mixing it with American Underground.
Hmm. Like
Jack Davis,
essentially,
Robert Crumb in there.
if you're imagining that this like sort of wild land ends up percolating up from the top of this, weird stew. The stews percolate. You end up with somebody else can kind of come through and sift,
Mm-hmm.
right? And find a bunch of stuff at the result of that, and then use. Yeah, it's interesting. Like, we don't think about popular figures in cartooning as being radical. But I would argue that you could probably draw a pretty close line from this early Smurfs Peo work to something like Von Bode and like Cheech Wizard or something like that.
Certainly, I have a theory that the origin of the graffiti style, uh, that kind of we all know kind of developed from Von Bode. I think that alley oop was the origin of that as well, or alley oop
Interesting.
probably because if you look at the way the alley oop characters are drawn, it looks so like proto Von Bode, but there's also it does feel like a lot of the Smurf stuff as well.
Yeah. And then once again, how many of these things can just be down to people using the same tools or finding similar solutions for the same problems over and over again? We will
Yeah,
not know.
certainly. And something I'm thinking a lot lately, I've been trying to find old magazines in Los Angeles, and it's very hard to just find like a stash of like magazines from 1990 anywhere. And it made me realize like how in past decades we were so immersed in just print and illustration everywhere around us. And we'll kind of hold on to like, here's the Jack Kirby comics from 1972, or here's the, Tintin comics from the 1960s. But there's so much kind of flotsam jetsam just illustration around them that we're kind of don't have access to anymore.
Right. Yeah, and then you have crazy people like Ryan Holmberg who go through and research a single artist's oeuvre. I don't know if you've read any of the you know books. The essay that he did for I'm not going to be able to pronounce the Japanese name. It's the Screw Style for the Yoshihara Suge book, and he ends up with the help of a bunch of other people being able to identify like seven or eight of the individual reference photographs he used
Oh
for
wow.
images in a single story,
Yeah, I saw recently somebody found a reference picture that Patrick Nagel based one of his famous um, album
Yeah.
cover, maybe the Duran Duran cover or something off
Yeah,
of.
it's the Duran Duran cover. They finally discovered it. This one particular guy who's, by the way, Instagram is Nagel Angel, uh, uh, found the Duran Duran source by looking through magazines of the appropriate time period that he thought Nagel might have had access to.
Yeah, I had a funny reaction to it too because somebody was like, there was some comment that was like, I wonder if this model is still around and if she could get royalties or something. And I was like, that's not how it works. like is it back to Mobius? It's just like so much of his work was just like riffing off of advertising
Right.
things like that. It's just like it's kind of what you do. It's I guess it's a bad analogy because I was thinking of it like music sampling, but then music sampling's gone kind of much more expensive because everybody's like, pay for this this clip. I was listening
Well,
to there's a De La Soul album where they had to take out a little Eddie Murphy thing where he's like, "You ever been hit by a car?" And it was just this tiny little thing at the beginning of their "No More No Less" song that doesn't exist anymore in the version.
oh man. Yeah, well, you can make the ethical argument that advertising stuff, especially, should be fair game because I didn't ask to be advertised to. I'm just going by, walking or going about my normal existence, and they are aggressively putting their images in front of me.
That was
So
always my
why?
argument for graffiti. It's like you should be if someone because I in my mind it's very different to have a building. Like if you have a building and you want to put out a sign, it's very different. But if you're just like it feels like almost cheating the system of property if you're just like I put up some sticks and a big billboard and now
Yeah.
you have to look at it because like it's not even a building behind it. And so I feel like in that it's like I didn't get any like what's my reason for having to look at your dumb Minions 2 billboard. I was thinking
Right.
this because I was in a really beautiful neighborhood recently in Los Angeles, and there was a giant Minions billboard, and I was like, that makes this neighborhood uglier. It's
Right.
this super tacky, like giant Walmart shelf in the normally pretty neighborhood. And something they do in Los Angeles is they'll do big graffiti pieces just over like the bottom half of a billboard, and it makes it look so much more interesting. There's a thing that a bunch of people were sharing online recently that it was like an anti OnlyFans billboard that was in Los Angeles that said gigantic "Stop Simping," and a graffiti writer had put a big piece on the bottom of it, and it made it look really I took a photo of it because it was so it was kind of perfect. It was like "Stop Simping" and then the guy's name giant like an ad for him. It seems like the kind of thing that
Joel,
yeah.
cut out the simping, Joel.
Exactly. Yeah, Joel, chill out. Before we
Yeah.
leave this to bed, or maybe this will spark a new
Yeah.
thing. Do you have a favorite Smurf story that you've read?
Oh, it's really hard to beat. My my kid thinks they're all equally good in the 5 volumes. To me, it seems like there's a little dip in 4 or 5, but I don't know. I might say that the ones that I've read so far, all of the ones that involve Dreamy Smurf or he has different names, Astro Smurf, the sort of like dreamer who wants to do something are quite compelling. But then the one with the king Smurf is just absolutely hilarious, like really cutting social satire.
Oh, I don't think I've
Um,
read that one because the Astro Smurf one I always think of. There's the one where he realizes that he wants to go to the moon,
right,
and
that's the
basically,
one. Yeah,
right, it's all about how the village kind of like he realizes he can't get to the moon because we're in medieval Europe. Don't be ridiculous. So they basically the Smurfs fake a moon landing,
right.
but with the astronaut as the one that's being lied to, where they basically like convince him that maybe they knock him out or something,
Yep.
or they
They give
and
him
then
they give him Smurfberry juice, which
yeah,
causes his intoxication, and
right. And then he
he
wakes up
wakes
and
up.
they've all disguised themselves as aliens and moved him to like an alien looking landscape. And so he's convinced that he like accomplished this great thing. And and they're all uh what's the director that the
Yeah,
they're
well,
Stanley Kubrick him.
right, exactly. They Kubricked him right across the head.
Yeah,
Yeah, no, there's a real darkness to it in terms of the worldview. I mentioned Papa Smurf. We both mentioned Papa Smurf a couple times. He's a benign, benevolent dictator.
sure.
That there's a whole thing where basically nobody else has any brains at all. Brainy, despite his name, is actually just as much of an idiot as the rest of them.
Right, maybe
Uh,
more so.
Right. Yeah. Right. Well, and he just is loquacious. He tell you they should call him, running mouth Smurf. But
Uh-huh.
the worldview that it kind of embodies is that there's a certain core to it that anybody will take power if they can have it. They're going to do just about as job as anybody else, and the true like sort of elite have both the respect but also the authority that you would expect from that like elite intelligence, and that you really basically have to find them so you can live in the village that where they're at. And if you don't and you abandon them, you're going to be totally screwed, you know?
Right. Fascinating. Yeah. Do you remember the later Smurfs? I remember the later Smurfs or cartoon series. I didn't get a chance to investigate if this exists at all in the comics when they brought in a grandpa Smurf and like a redheaded pigtailed girl.
No, 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 no. And I remember this is the first time that I had the experience that, obviously didn't call it that at the time, but the experience of thinking that something I liked jumped the shark.
Oh,
Uh,
interesting.
the as a kid, I remember with this when they brought in the kid Smurfs, including the pigtailed girl, being like, "What the hell? They came from where?" There's
Right.
this. No, they're not in the comics as far as I can tell. Although the comics has a baby Smurf at one point. And I think that that's sort of the nod that they were looking for. They also had a big puppy in the Hanna-Barbera cartoon that came with the little kids.
Oh,
And
that's great.
that's definitely like when they start, that's like season 6 or 7 or something when they're like, oh, I don't know about this premise anymore. Let's jazz it up. You know,
There
let's
is
get a
something fascinating when you get
picnic
to know,
basket.
yeah, you get to know something as just this like things never change. It is always the same, and then suddenly it's like they've shaken it up. It does make me. It got my attention, I guess. I don't know if it. Do they talk about Smurf reproduction? Because it certainly like implies that there's something weird going on.
Yeah. I mean, as far as I know, there is no Smurf reproduction because there's a big plot in one of the earlier comics that there's only 99 Smurfs
Uh-huh.
in existence, and then they have a 100th Smurf that comes in. So I mean, I don't know if they can really get into it. They have social differences. They talk about northern Smurfs versus southern Smurfs and how they use the word Smurf differently,
Hmm.
and Civil War basically. But they don't really get into the physiognomy of them, or presumably once one is killed, another one buds asexually. I bet they hide their reproductive organs underneath their hats. That's my
Yeah,
guess.
that's certainly. Uh, yeah, that's a good guess because there's a funny thing about Smurfette being brought in as this like as this Jezebel to seduce them if they're just basically like a race of creatures that doesn't produce in any like with any sexual desire.
Right. Well, they definitely have some kind of desire for her. Yeah, but at this point, I kind of feel like I'm. This is kind of the time when I had a conversation with somebody about peanuts, and I ended up saying it sucks. They're trapped in hell. They're frozen forever as children.
That is something it really affects me with for some reason superhero comics that really bothers me more than anything. And I think I've ranted forever about how the timeline of Peter Parker's life depresses me when I think about it because he's like it's moving because they acknowledge these real world events, like 9/11 is in Spider-Man, but like it didn't happen, you know, 25 years ago for Spider-Man. It happened maybe like 6 months ago.
Right. Yeah,
And to
and
me,
six
that
and
makes me
six
go,
months before that, he was fighting street criminals in a disco. You know.
yeah, yeah, definitely. It's like he went to school in the 60s.
Yeah.
He was in college, and then yeah, and like he's maybe in his late 30s now, but yeah, it's kind of and there's a theory actually that the Fantastic Four initially was set in real time.
Right.
Then at a certain point when they had their kid Franklin, they decided to slow things down, and there's a theory that that's when it stopped being a super relevant comic.
Yeah, I have a theory that it's definitely stopped being good.
Yeah, I wonder
Yeah.
because I like the John Byrne ones, but there is a
Yeah.
certain element of fan fiction to them.
No, there's I mean, look, when those were running concurrently, when that was part of the culture. Stan Lee was a weird figure who, gave talks and did interviews, and there was events when things happened in the comics, and it's hard to have that kind of illusion when all you have anymore is the illusion of movement. That's a frustration I have with Peanuts. It's not a frustration that I share with the Smurfs because they're magical, and they do seem to have, you know,
And they
they
have
don't have
such
an
long
end.
lives that who knows? It's like if a Papa Smurf is 500 years old, and also what happened to the other Smurfs that were around? Did they all die off before they reached his age because it was a a battle for power on who would be the Papa Smurf.
They got eaten by Gargamel and his ancestors. That's my best guess. They do seem to be mortal. At least they're all afraid of death. Although I don't recall actually seeing any of them killed.
Like, I need to see a Smurf murder.
That Smurfs learn about murder. Yeah, the one of the ones where they harness a giant bird is quite amazing. You know, it's a giant eagle or whatever. Uh, you know, they want to bend to their will. Anyway, that's way too much about the Smurfs. Uh, we can't do it, Brandon. We can't keep it we can't keep it to a bite-sized Smurf-sized.
I know. We got too many apples piled on top of each other. We can't keep it to three.
Exactly. Well, go buy them if you can find them. Here they are. You can drool over them if you want. I think volumes 2, 3, and 4 are easily available, and not so much for 1 and 5. But yeah, they're really enjoyable, and my kids just love them to bits. And I can't wait to see if all of this influence that I'm pouring into them actually, makes a difference in their cartooning when they're of age. We will find out.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it certainly will make their memories of their childhood interesting. How much cool, weird stuff they were exposed to.
Maybe they'll appreciate it when they're in their 40s.
Certainly.
All right. Have a good one, everybody.
Solid Yellow, Path of the Shades by Clarence Doss is a really cool ongoing project that Living the Line will be producing. Clarence is a PhD student from Fiji who's studying the myths of Fiji for his doctoral thesis. And part of that study project is that he's producing these comics. They're kind of like Hellboy, where there's these little short stories that capture all of these different mythologies. But then he's using that to wrap the project into his doctoral thesis and then provide educational material where people can come to these comics. They don't have to read his PhD thesis. They can come to the comics and get a more consumable version of the mythology of Fiji.